Hello, my name is Father Gregory Pine, and I'm a Dominican friar of the province of St. Joseph, and this is Pints of Aquinas. I just wanted to verify down there that I had actually pushed record because I have sometimes failed to push record and then delivered a video and then looked down and realized that I've just been talking to myself the whole time, which is awesome. Not to say that I don't talk to myself all the time, but I prefer to record it when I intend to record it. Okay, so in this video, we're going to talk about predestination. Why? Well, when you hear predestination, often you think about double predestination, which is the Calvinist or Reformed doctrine, which teaches that God has a foreordained notion as to whether this particular creature, this particular human being, will go to heaven or will go to hell, and that our, particular exercise of agency is just a matter of bringing that about inexorably, okay? So it seems to trivialize the contribution of free will in a way that many find terrifying. So when people think about it in Catholic circles, they're like, yikes, thank God we don't believe in predestination. But here's the deal. We do believe in predestination, but it's a different kind of predestination. Wait, what do you mean, Father Gregory? Well, keep watching to find out. Here we go. Okay, in order to situate the conversation, let's talk a little bit about God and man, and then about providence, and then we'll talk about predestination, and then a final word about free will. So first, God and man. Okay, so God creates man. God creates human beings, and creation is just a relation of dependence. So we rely upon God for everything, which is to say our being and our acting, and the conservation of our being and the conservation of our acting. All right, so God is present to us in creation. St. Thomas will say by essence, presence, and power. So yeah, that's a cool little question if you want to check it out. Prima pars question 8. You're like, nerd, I don't want to check it out. All right, well, okay, just a suggestion. Moving on. Now, God is further present to us by grace. So with a life of grace, he dwells in us as in a temple, and with grace we participate in his very divine life. So grace has a way of healing and perfecting our nature, specifically as made to the image and likeness of God. So with grace, we come to know God as he knows himself, and to love God as he loves himself with God's own knowledge and love. Boom. All right, so there's a little setup point about God and man. Now, let's talk about where we fit within the plan of God. Typically, we describe this as providence. How do you get to the doctrine of providence? St. Thomas thinks, I would argue, that providence is actually something that you can prove by reason. All right, so God reveals it, obviously, but it's also that, it's something that you can reason to, like the existence of God, or the fact that God is uncomplicated or undivided, etc. Okay, so what is providence? Providence means, in effect, that God has a notion. He has a notion of himself, and in that notion, he knows all of the different ways in which creatures can share in him, can share in his divine life, or can share in himself. It's basically like he knows all of the deficient ways in which creation can express his divine abundance, all right? His divine perfection. What is more, God doesn't just know these things, but he knows all of the causal interactions among these things, both potentially and actually. So he knows what could be, like what is purely possible, and he knows what is, which is to say the things that at one time, whether past, present, or future, are really existing, okay? And what is more, all right, so God knows the things, he knows all the causal interactions among those things, and then God directs those things towards their end, which is to say towards himself. So the kind of notional piece we call divine providence, and then the kind of directional piece we call divine governance. I don't know why I shook like that to describe providence and governance. Never have providence and governance been described in such terms. Okay, so the thing is that God's providence embraces all of creation. So there's no part of creation that falls outside of the bounds of God's providence. Like even the devil falls within the bounds of the divine providence. And you might read Matthew chapter 13, the parable of the wheat and the tares, or the wheat and the weeds, to bring home this point. So even the evil things that go on in God's plan, all right, they happen by his permission, and by his providence, he brings them back to, the glory of God and the salvation of souls. So even, for instance, human sin, he'll have it returned to him by punishment or by mercy or by whatever else, okay? So providence is just this kind of practical, notional dimension of God's eternal law, as God causes each thing according to its proper nature. And within this, all right, each thing exercises its own kind of causality. So rocks act rockily, and plants act plantily, and animals act animally, and human beings act humanly, and angels act angelically. Okay? So human beings act humanly, which is to say, we act with our intellect and our will, all right, which sets us apart from the beasts. So we act freely. And St. Thomas has this cool little line where he says, God not only creates things to be and creates things to act, but he creates them to act according to the proper principles. So God creates necessary things to happen necessarily, and then contingent things to happen contingently, or we could say free things to happen freely. And part of the reason for which is because God kind of wants to see how it'll go. Not in the sense that he's surprised by it, but in the sense that he wants to entrust us with this particular nature so that we can, work out the details. Okay, so then we have now arrived at the point of describing predestination. I don't know why I'm in a silly mood. I'm like feeling on the brink of giggly, but here we go. 4 John. We're talking about predestination here, Father Gregory. Get serious. So when we talk about predestination, we're talking about a free creature's participation in the plan of providence. Okay. We're talking about a free creature's participation in the plan of providence. So we said God has a notion of himself, of all the different things that could participate his divine life, and of the things that do in fact participate the divine life, and of their causal interactions, all right? And that he is ordering them towards the end of himself. The part of that plan, which concerns human beings, is just what we mean by predestination. So God is present to these things, these created things, by essence, presence, and power, and further, he's further present to the just by grace, and in this presence there is a kind of predestination, okay? So this plan of providence or of predestination, it accounts for the fact that we are in time. So it accounts for our temporal unfolding. So it's not something that just says, ba-bow, predestined, ba-bow, predestined, ba-bow, not predestined, ba-bow, predestined. No, it's something that unfolds according to the proper law of the creature who was concerned by it, which is to say, by us. All right, so we said necessary things necessarily and contingent things contingently, which is to say free things freely. So his predestination unfolds in a way proper to this particular creature, which is to say freely. Now, his predestination is infallible in himself. So we're talking about the divine knowledge, which doesn't change, okay? And it's intrinsically efficacious. So what God knows happens, what God knows does. And yet, God's grace can be resisted, which is to say the effect of his predestination can be resisted. Now, mind you, even this is part of the plan, which is complicated, which is to say, I don't really understand it in its entirety. I don't want to mislead you by describing it poorly, but I also don't want to try to over-explain a thing which is, at heart, mysterious, okay? What we can say at this stage, though, is predestination in the Catholic understanding, and here's the big difference from the Calvinist or Reformed teaching on double predestination. So the Catholic understanding or Catholic teaching of predestination is of single predestination. So God predestines the elect to heaven. So we would say, for instance, in accord with the Church's doctrinal clarification in the Council of Kiersey and Valence, that if one goes to heaven, it is by God's predestinating grace. But if one goes to hell, it's by that individual's choice against God's grace. Okay? Now, God will confirm the punishment of that soul in heaven. Okay, so God doesn't predestine that soul to hell in the sense of positively causing that soul to go to hell. Okay, but God does punish that soul upon finality of the choice against the divine plan or against God's predestinating grace. Okay, so what do we mean by this? Well, God will give to each soul at least the grace sufficient to take the next step. All right, so we'll talk about graces are like antecedent and consequent, or prevenient and consequent, which is to say, like, graces are kind of daisy chained together. So there's the grace of kind of wanting to go into a church, and there's the grace of sitting in the pew, and there's the grace of listening to preaching, and there's the grace of being provoked to inquire further into the Catholic faith, and there's the grace of reading the catechism, and there's the grace of expressing a desire to enter the RCIA program, and then there's the grace of being baptized. Okay, so graces are daisy chained together, and God is constantly offering grace. There's Garrigou-Lagrange will say that in every moment of every day, God is offering to even the most hardened of sinners at least the grace sufficient to pray. Okay, so that's not the grace of justification, but it is a grace. And when one consents to and cooperates with that grace, often enough, there are further graces in its wake, further graces daisy-chained to it. which isn't to say that like your consent and your cooperation makes for the graces to happen, because it's always God who's giving them. But still, so God is giving grace sufficient to salvation, but he doesn't necessarily give grace efficient to salvation. He's not kind of forcing on us the grace which we would have to accept, we'd have to welcome freely. Okay, so God predestines to heaven, and that's efficacious, right? It's intrinsically efficacious, but it's infallible and efficacious. But God does not override the free inner workings of a free creature. Now, he can act interior to us and natural to us in a way that is, in fact, more interior, more natural than we are to ourselves. So we can bring it about that we consent freely by a kind of sovereign move. But still, we're affirming here, even in this kind of most obscure of mysteries, a human liberty which can resist grace, which can not consent to or not cooperate with grace, and which can choose, in effect, lower goods which exclude the higher good, which eventuate in the punishment of heaven, which God will then ratify. Okay. So, basically, what we're talking about here is single predestination. So the reason whereby one goes to heaven pre-exists in God's providence, and as it concerns a free creature, we refer to it as predestination. And this is something that comes forth from the divine wisdom and the divine love. It's antecedent to any merit, so it's not like God sees like, oh, this person's going to make good use of my graces, so I'll give this person my graces. Right? God does not respond to us in this way. God does not react to us in this way. It's something that God initiates. It's something that God provokes. Okay? So then, within this whole thing that I've described, which raises more questions than it answers, and I recognize that, but you're going to find good resources on this in Gary Lagrange, for instance, who wrote a book called Providence and wrote another book called Predestination, so you can consult both of them. And then St. Thomas, it's based on St. Thomas's work. So in the Prima Pars of the Summa Theologiae, questions 22 and 23 are especially precious, but I would recommend that you just read questions 2 through 26, because that gives you the full scope. So then what of free will, you might ask? Well, great question. St. Thomas will affirm that we are free because we are ordered to this life with God. So we have an intellect and a will, which are broken open to a certain universality. So our intellect is made for the universally true, and our will is made for the universally good, which is to say, both will only ever rest in God. So Yves Simon will say, because we are superdetermined to God, we are underdetermined with respect to other goods. So because we're never satisfied except in God, that means that we're never satisfied with created goods. Okay? So we remain free with respect to those created goods, and they're not going to override our free will or force our hand. So we proceed towards our end, something I repeat often. We proceed towards our end by many movements en route to a perfect liberty. So we come into this world possessed of the capacity for freedom, but it's something that we have to develop. It's something that we have to grow in so that we become more fixed, more firm, more stable in the good, and therefore better able to choose what leads to the good. And that the life of grace works within us to heal us, to grow us, in order to bring this about, so that ultimately we can be confirmed in freedom, and this is paradoxical, or not paradoxical, but it's strange, confirmed in freedom in the life of heaven, right, in the life of glory, where we will not but choose God, and we can choose all other things in light of God, as ways to God, or as issuing from God. So God is able to perfect our freedom, acting on us in a way that is interior, according to our proper principles, and that's most natural and nonviolent, as we described previously. So God is able to preserve and perfect free will, even while promoting the divine life in us. And God is motivated to do so, because otherwise creation doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Why would God create us when he doesn't need us, except to manifest his glory and to save our souls? So when we talk about predestination, it doesn't do away with secondary causes. It doesn't do away with our place in the plan. Like, for instance, God delights in the prayers of the saints, not because he needs them, but because he wants it such that the things that they pray for come about through their prayers, because it's better that way. Not that God just does it directly or immediately, but that he does it through the prayers of the saints, right, by their supplication or by their praise, so that those, whatever goods are obtained, redound to the glory of the saints, and ultimately redound, to like the building up of the church, who comes together in this communion for the glory of God and the salvation of those present. So, yeah, God wills not only that this happen, but the way that it happens and that causality that obtains among the things through which it happens, which is wild, whilst we remain free and able to affirm or deny, which is the dark underbelly and scary downside, but able to affirm that our freedom is ultimately to be best expressed in following the ways of God's predestinating grace. So that is a super wild and somewhat complicated topic. I hope that I've explained it just in such a way that you're able to take something from this video. Apologies if it's been more confusing than it has been helpful. But again, questions 22 and 23 from the Prima Pars of the Summa Theologiae, and then the books Providence and Predestination by Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange will help you going forward. All right, that's it. So this is Pints with Aquinas. If you haven't yet, please do subscribe to the channel, push the bell, get email updates when other things happen that are cool. And then if you haven't yet, please do check out Godsplaining, a podcast that I contribute to with 4 other Dominican friars. And yeah, have we done anything on predestination? No, we have not. So no help to you. And then last, I have a book called Prudence, Choose Confidently, Live Boldly. Also has next to nothing to do with predestination, except that prudence is basically our participation in the providence of God. So if you think about it in those terms, it's pretty sweet. And I mentioned that, I think, in chapter 3. Yeah, sounds right. Maybe 4. Both of them. Why not? Okay, know of my prayers for you. Please pray for me, and I'll look forward to chatting with you next time on Pints with Aquinas.